Welcome to Betrayal Trauma Recovery, BTR.org. I'm Anne. I'm sure you remember what it was like when you were searching for help, maybe for your husband, hoping to find the right program or therapist. That's why I started podcasting. I supported my husband through 7 years of pornography addiction recovery, and not one therapist during that time told me I was experiencing emotional and psychological abuse and sexual coercion. I didn't want any other woman on the planet to be in the dark. If you're like the majority of my listeners, you're experiencing the type of abuse that's invisible and difficult to wrap your head around. Your husband is using porn or having affairs or lying to you, and you're getting the same bad advice about how to improve communication or your relationship. If you need support from women who totally understand, check out our daily group session schedule at btr.org/group. We'd love to see you in a session today. One simple, anonymous way to help spread the word is to click, follow, or subscribe to the Betrayal Trauma Recovery podcast on your favorite podcasting app. While you're there, every 5-star rating helps make this podcast more visible and will help save other women from getting the wrong kind of help, like a couple program that will make this type of abuse worse. For those of you who follow or subscribe to this podcast, thank you so much. Your support means so much to me. Amy Nordhues is on the podcast today. She's a survivor of both childhood sex abuse and sex abuse as an adult at the hands of a mental health professional. She is a passionate Christ follower and expert on the healing God provides. She has a BA in psychology and minors in sociology and criminology. Her devotions have been published in the Secret Place devotional series. Her memoir, Preyed Upon, won the Inspire Christian Writers Great Openings Contest for Nonfiction and the Next Generation Indie Award for Inspirational Nonfiction. As a married mother of 3, she enjoys spending time with family, writing, reading, photography, and all things comedy. Welcome, Amy.
Hi, it's so good to be here.
We have comedy in common. When I first found out about my husband's lying and deceit, I actually started writing comedy to deal with it, like to process it. So I wrote a comedy blog for a few years that wasn't showing what was actually happening. So when my book comes out, I actually am publishing that comedy blog in book form at the same time so that you can see like what was really happening.
Oh, interesting.
I think a lot of comedians use jokes to deal with their trauma.
Yes.
So maybe we'll make a few abuse jokes today.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
It's a weird
Don't worry.
combination.
My audience gets it because they're all abuse victims. So let's start with your story.
Yeah, I started attending Celebrate Recovery. I was wanting to work on issues from past abuse, a disconnected marriage. I had depression and anxiety. And when I was in that program, the pastor's wife became my mentor. And at some point, she recommended that I see this therapist. He was also a psychiatrist, which was good because he could manage my medications. And he was an elder at the church where the Celebrate Recovery was hosted. And I had just started attending there as well. So it just seemed to line up perfectly. So I started to see him, and he was an odd character, more like a bumbling grandpa. Very Christian, wore a cross necklace, sweet, kind of goofy. And right away, he played a father figure role. He learned that that was something that I didn't have, and so he played into that. And at first, it seemed like it was an answer to prayer. It seemed like my depression was lifting. I started to see, I guess you could say, red flags.
At the time, what was your thought process? Did you know they were red flags? Would you define them that way? Can you talk about your thought process?
In retrospect, I realized the red flags started from day one. And those things I didn't see as red flags. I just thought they were quirky, silly, like he would get an Afghan out of his cupboard and like kind of match it to what clothing I was wearing and then playfully cover me up with it. Well, my alarm bells went off, but I certainly didn't think this is a predator trying to weasel his way into my personal space. This is just a silly older gentleman therapist trying to put me at ease in an awkward therapy situation. He would bring me tea when I didn't see any harm in that. We both would drink tea during the sessions. So they were little things like that, and I brushed them off. But when he offered to rub my feet or my shoulders for a Christmas present, I panicked. He'd never touched me in a session. He sat across from me in his chair. And the sad reality is that I didn't think I could say no. I had voices screaming in my head, like, pick one, pick one. This is awkward. This is brutally awkward. And so I said, shoulders. And he came over and sat next to me in the chair and started to rub my shoulders. And I panicked and I said, feet, feet, just to get him away. And the touch felt creepy. Sadly, I say sadly because now I wish I could have just stood up and left, but I kind of slumped down in my chair and put my feet on the ottoman and allowed him to rub my feet.
Because we reject victim blaming here at BTR, would you feel comfortable saying coerced rather than allowed?
Yeah, I didn't think that no was a choice. So
Right. So that's coercion, right?
do it quickly and get it over with, or put it off and then still do it.
Right. And it's coercion.
It is coercion.
This isn't you allowing him to do this. This is you are coerced to do this because you feel like you have no other option.
Right. It was the most awkward, uncomfortable thing I could ever imagine. And on top of that, I felt like it was my job to make the room feel more comfortable for the discomfort he was causing me. So as we continue to talk in therapy, I'm just like, look him in the eyes, just ignore him rubbing your feet, just ignore it. You're making this worse, as if this is a problem I brought on. It's just so unfair. I ran this red flag by my mentor. Again, he was an elder at our church and she was the pastor's wife. And I wasn't seeing it as a sinister red flag, but I was seeing it as a very weird red flag. And when I told her, she said, he's so sweet.
Was he married at the time?
Yes, he's married. He was 65 years old.
Okay, so he's 65. He's physically coercing clients and also emotionally and physically cheating on his wife.
Yes.
And she's saying he's so sweet. This probably isn't the first time she's heard this then.
After this whole nightmare ended, I learned that another young lady, much younger than me, who she was also mentoring, was sitting on his lap in sessions. So she was almost like a pawn in this whole scam.
The pastor's wife?
Yes, I feel like, because she suggested him to me, and she knew that this young woman who had committed suicide under his care 20 years prior was sitting on his lap during sessions.
What?
Yeah, it devastated me. I thought, and you sent me to him? I don't think she was in on it with him per se. I think she was unhealthy.
Right. She didn't understand coercion. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and believed that the people that were going to him were so mentally ill that he was doing everything in his power to help them. And so maybe he had to try more unconventional means.
There's that. And it's the sex addiction industry in general, or therapists who work with sex addicts in general, believe addicts. So if a sex addict is sitting in a sex addiction therapist's office and the sex addict is saying, well, if my wife would do this, or if she would do this, things would be better. Like if she were more kind to me, or if she respected me more. And so it's this racket where the sex addict husband and the sex addict therapist end up abusing the wife more and more over time.
Yeah. Yeah. And these predators don't start abusing victims until they have everyone around them adequately groomed. They have all the pieces lined up.
Yeah.
He even had the confidence, even though it backfired on him, but he had the confidence to go after me, knowing I was good friends with the pastor's wife. That's how much he thought he'd get away with it.
Absolutely.
And I keep going. I think, yeah, he's a little kooky, and I let it go. We did a very odd spiritual type therapy, which just added to the confusion because I was a new Christian. And there was another huge red flag. So I shared with him during one of my sessions that I had imagined myself dancing with Jesus like a father-daughter dance at a wedding, because that was not something I ever had, and how it was kind of a sweet thought. So the next time I show up for therapy, he says, I thought we could dance. And I just felt my face go beet red, and I just wanted to escape through a trapdoor. And again, no wasn't an option. I figured it out quickly because you're making this more uncomfortable by sitting here being uncomfortable. Again, the burden falls on the victim.
Absolutely. Think about an actual caring, empathetic person, not even a therapist. They're going to see that look flash across your face. And they're going to be like, oh, do you want to? How do you feel about it? An empathetic person would have some type of awareness.
Oh, yeah.
When your face goes red or when you look confused, abusers just plow right through that. Like, she didn't say anything, so I can move forward.
I think I covered my face. I was that uncomfortable. In my head, I'm thinking, you mentioned dancing. He's trying to help you. It's a therapeutic thing. Like, he's 65. And since standing up and walking away wasn't an option, number one, I thought that was rude. And number two, I was connected to him at this time. He made sure I was very emotionally attached. He had isolated me more by this time. I really thought he was the source of me feeling better, getting better. So I made myself do it. It was brutal. And when it was over, I thought, this never has to happen again.
I want to point out the resistance here. So, as a victim, you are resisting through quote unquote getting it over with. Victims think, why didn't I stop it? And I want to point out that getting it done quickly because you don't think you have a choice is a form of resisting abuse. So you are resisting abuse every step of the way here. Your face is turning red. You're putting your face in your hands. You're trying to be safe. So as you're resisting, he has multiple times where he to make a different choice and not abuse you, but he just keeps manipulating you and pushing
Yeah,
forward.
I
So
appreciate you saying that. And I feel like a lot of your listeners will understand that. I think some people, though, they judge harshly and they think it's really easy. You just stand up and leave, or you slap them across the face and you leave. They don't understand the layers upon layers of manipulation that have already formed a web around you. That's when they make bigger moves, when they know that you won't leave, when they know you're too afraid to leave or you feel too guilty to leave, whatever it is. And I ran that by my close friend. And again, she thought it was sweet. And then I worked up the courage to tell her that he touched an inappropriate body part while we were dancing and something snapped in her. And she said, I trust him implicitly. And I knew in that moment I was on my own. So I didn't share anything else with her. I thought, I will fix this relationship with the therapist. It's just gone off the rails a little bit. Maybe it was my fault. It always feels like our fault. If I wasn't needy and I didn't like the idea of a father figure, then I wouldn't have caused these things to happen. And what's really sad is in therapy, you're so vulnerable because I was giving him the information with which he could use against me.
exactly.
And when I'm providing the information and then he uses it against me, I feel like I'm the one that brought it up. But all I'm doing is going to therapy. It makes it extra confusing. Well, you said you imagine, well, no, I didn't say I want to dance with you or I want a romantic relationship with you.
You were resisting abuse the entire time. So this is just an aside for comedic relief. And how is you cheating on your wife helping me therapeutically?
Oh, like he's going above and beyond to help me. And part of me believed that it was a blessing that he was going above and beyond, but not at the time. I just wanted to escape.
I want to point out more resisting abuse. So you go for help from your friend and you realize instinctively that she's not safe, even if you don't have the words for it. And so you pull back, which is a form of resistance. At every step, you're trying to figure out how to get out of this.
Yes, it feels like you're in a maze and you hit this wall. And with telling her that, I hit that wall. That was one of my escape opportunities. I was really counting on that one too. I just was crushed when she said that. And then even more, it made me start thinking, no one's going to believe me. He's a doctor, he's a therapist, and he's a church elder. And he's 20 years my senior. Who else am I going to tell? And if I tell someone who maybe hasn't ever been in therapy or hasn't had my specific issues, they're going to jump on me right away. They're going to say, it's your fault because you went back. So then you're more isolated, and then it keeps going. And sadly, the abuser becomes the comforter because he's the only one that understands the abuse that he's inflicting on you. It's a very
Mm-hmm.
twisted situation.
Well, and he was doing it on purpose so that he can comfort you. He creates the problem so that he can be the solution, which is a very intense form of manipulation.
Yes. It's like, who else is there? He's the only
Mm-hmm.
one left.
Mm-hmm.
And they can turn on the charm when they need to. I'll skip to the end. So there's only a few more months of therapy, and my panic is just rising because at this point he's turning up the heat, and he loves me. And
Whoa, whoa, whoa. Turning up the heat like he's in love with you romantically?
okay, this is the way he weaseled into it. So he had really established himself as a father figure, right? And I feel like
Mm-hmm.
he was stuck in that role. And so he started saying, the key was, a part of my heart loves you like a father, but the teenage part of me loves you in a romantic way. Well, I didn't know what to do with that. I was like, what does that even mean? And then I thought, well, maybe that's how all males feel.
Sex addiction therapists want people to think, oh, this is how men are, rather than this is wrong.
Right. So I'm thinking, well, he's not going to act on that teenage part. So he's just admitting that. And that's vulnerable for him to say.
It's also very creepy.
Super creepy. I mean, I was in panic mode for days, weeks, like coming home, I'm just twirling my hair and pacing around the house like, I don't know how to digest this information. And again, I didn't think we were on a trajectory towards abuse. I thought these were random incidences. So I thought, okay, he's just fallen in love with his patient. Maybe that's common for therapists, but he's not going to act on it. He's not going to do anything about it.
When you say on the trajectory for abuse, you didn't think that you were on the trajectory, but even just talking now, he had been abusing you from the very beginning. So it's like, I don't realize this is where it's going, but then I also don't realize this has been the intent from day one.
No, I have no idea that's the intent. And never in my wildest dreams would I have thought he had an evil bone in his body.
And that he'd been abusing you the entire time. Because grooming is abuse.
Yeah, and I can remember when I got out saying, well, the first red flag was, and somebody who knew better saying, no, no, no. The first red flag was on day one. And then I started thinking, yeah, you're right. I was groomed from the very beginning. When you're not a sociopath and you can't think like a sociopath and you're empathetic, you give people the benefit of the doubt. And after I'd get over each red flag, it would go into the background. And so each incident was unrelated to the next. I saw no pattern. Even when it was getting inappropriate, like, you can't love me, you're married, and you're my therapist. Again, I didn't think it was sinister. So I was like, well, you're going to need to rein that in, and that's not okay with me, and that's not going to work. But I didn't see it as, this is all part of my master plan to get you where I want you to be.
I think that's the thing that is so difficult for victims, and therapists also don't understand it, is that it's intentional. When a wife goes in about her husband's abuse, therapists are like, oh, he told me he didn't mean that. He's just bumbling around. Men know women don't want to be abused. That's why they can act really nice and awesome. If they thought women wanted to be abused, they would be like, okay, I'm going to cheat on my wife. So men know they are intentional. It's the therapists in general that don't think that. And then this therapist, to add another layer on it, is actually intending to abuse you directly.
Correct. He was the abuser. And he made sure to isolate me from my husband as well. So it was just him and me. And so it was fix it or leave. And for whatever reason, I couldn't leave. I know now the reasons. He had layered so many different things. Like, he had told me so much about his personal life that he seemed like a fragile individual. He said it would kill me if you ever left. I felt too guilty to leave. I thought it would kill him. He had stopped charging me for sessions. The reason I wasn't super disturbed by it was that it happened at the first of the year when my insurance wasn't paying. And I brought it to the attention of the secretary, and I could see him smiling in the background. And I realized, oh, he's intentionally not charging me. And I felt like a pit in my stomach. I felt just that uneasiness of that's not right. And then I was like, oh, I had told him how I was always told as a child how expensive I was by my father, and how he's trying to make me know that my worth isn't based on any dollar amount. So again, he used something I shared with him in therapy. And then the other reason I didn't completely full on panic was that I knew my insurance would kick in a couple months. And literally in my head, I thought, it's fine, Amy. He's a doctor. I don't think you're going to bankrupt him.
With other victims of therapy abuse, I've heard that before, that they stop charging them.
Right.
Maybe they do that so that they can claim they weren't a client.
Yeah. And also for me, it made me feel indebted. Money's tight, and here he's doing this for free. He cares so much more than the average person.
I want to put that out to my listeners if that has ever happened where the therapist stopped charging, and then when you made a complaint, if they said, well, she wasn't paying me, so she wasn't a client, because this is my theory. If they're aware of this ever happening, that they let me know, because I'm wondering if this is a preemptive way to avoid losing their license if someone reports them. The good news of having a community of victims is that we start to see patterns. So you can know, like, oh, if they stop charging you, it could be a sign that they're setting up to
right. And
defend themselves or some other thing. In your case, so that you would feel indebted. Yeah.
An ethical therapist won't ever stop charging you. I can see there being maybe some situation where you have to work something out. It's short term. Mm-hmm. I'm just saying it's a red flag. I'm going to just skip to the end. He weasels his way over to my side of the office to sit next to me because that has to happen before he can do anything else. So I was emotional one particular session, and he came over and sat across from me on the ottoman and dabbed my tears with a tissue, which was embarrassing. It felt fatherly, but also very embarrassing. But I told myself, it's sweet. He's just trying to be sweet. He's just trying to be compassionate. Well, then he pretended he was uncomfortable sitting there, and I didn't want him to go back to his side of the office because it was soothing to me. And this is after I'd been seeing him now for a year. And I asked him if he would sit next to me in the oversized chair for the remainder of the session, and he did. So later, when he does eventually assault me, I feel like it's my fault because I asked him to sit next to me, and I don't want to tell anybody because I'm so ashamed. I'm ashamed that I'm in therapy. I'm ashamed that I wanted a father figure. I'm ashamed that I'm an adult and I was duped. I'm ashamed for the parts that I thought were my idea. Of course, none of it was my idea, but master manipulators use you in your own abuse process. Mm-hmm. And it makes it very confusing and maddening when you get out to try to peel it apart and see that you weren't responsible at all.
And that you were resisting the entire time, trying to stop it the entire time.
Oh, yes. Yeah. And I was going in at the end in tears saying, I can't do this. This is hurting me. I need you to stop. And he wouldn't stop. For a long time, I was like, is he hurting me? I think he is. But then I got to a place where I was like, he's hurting me. Why can't I leave? And it was a brief period, but still it was very confusing at the time. And I couldn't break the tie on my own. I just couldn't do it. He would guilt me. He would cry. He would do something, and I would cave. So I, again, went to the only person I knew to go to, my mentor. But this time, I went to her spouse. I went to the pastor. And I told him, and he believed me.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. And he says, what do you need? And I said, I just need someone to sit with me because my therapy sessions, I'm embarrassed to say, had gone from 1 hour to 2 hours to 3 hours.
See, that is another red flag. That's a for sure red flag. Huge. Is if they go over time.
Huge. And, I never asked for more time. And he just surprised me with it one time. And I said, well, my time's up. And he said, oh, I was able to move people around to get us an extra hour. And then I had the same pit in my stomach. And then again, I rationalized it. Well, okay, well, cool. Well, I guess more time is good. That's okay. That's nice. And then I got used to it. And it went to 3 hours at the very end. At that point, I was so attached and so alone outside of this little bubble that he had created that I almost wanted that time. Anyway, I tell my pastor everything and I say, I just need somebody to sit with me during my 3-hour session because I'll cave. He'll call, he'll cry, he'll guilt me. I don't know. I can't break the tie. So they did. They sat with me. But when that session was over, I knew that at least one tie was broken and I wouldn't go back. Now I remained attached, emotionally attached for months. The doctor called 9 times and left 9 voicemails, but I knew physically I wouldn't return. That's the other very maddening thing. I know the answer, although it's hard to put into words. Why do we remain attached to people that we know are hurting us? First of all, it took me a long time to see that this was grooming. This wasn't love. This was never love. This was a man who liked to trap women in psychological cages and then torment them for fun. It's so hard to wrap your mind around that level of evil that it's just hard to get there. That's what I needed. I needed to know I am hurting you intentionally because I felt too much compassion if it was unintentional. If he was just human, if he was just a man, if he just slipped, if he'd just gotten in too deep, I could be more patient with those things, and I needed to see the evil, and I got a chance to see it at the very end.
I think that all victims feel that way. And so one thing that I try to point out is that if you feel uncomfortable, his intentions don't matter. Giving women permission to not worry about the intentions, to be like, you might be nice, but you in your good guy form makes me uncomfortable. Giving women permission to realize like, oh, I don't have to worry about his intentions. All I have to worry about is how I feel.
Yes. And sadly, I didn't have the self-worth to think that my opinion could trump other people's, especially a pastor's. Other friends that went to this psychiatrist and loved him and thought he was amazing. So I always dismissed my own gut instincts. And one thing I always like to point out is that my gut instincts were spot on. We aren't naive. We aren't gullible. We aren't stupid. We're not missing all these things. What we're doing is we're allowing them to slip through. We're minimizing them. We're rationalizing them. We don't feel, I guess, that we can say no.
I think we're resisting it the whole time and we're trying to figure it out. I don't think we're rationalizing anything. We are resisting in the only way we know how to at the time. You were resisting because you were trying to tell your friend. You were resisting because your face was turning red. You were resisting because you weren't saying, oh, I'd love to do that.
Right. I say rationalizing. That was part of the resisting. How can I make this situation more comfortable for myself and feel less scary and awkward? Is to try to find other reasons for maybe why he did certain things. So the whole thing is just trying to survive it.
Yes.
In the best way we can until we can figure it out or until we can get enough support to leave. After my pastor and his wife sat with me during that last session, I knew I wouldn't go back. However, I was highly traumatized and I was still attached to a point, to the abuser. I was ashamed and embarrassed, and I was confused as to how he manipulated me and why I stayed so long and why I allowed what I allowed, that I didn't have plans to tell anybody after that. But in time, I got up the courage to report him to the medical board because he was a psychiatrist. The medical board process took about 9 months, and in the end, he was allowed to surrender his license permanently. I guess doctors have the opportunity to renew their license in my state after a year, but in this case, it was a permanent surrender of license. So that was some bit of justice, but it just felt so unfair. He was already retirement age, and so he got to pretend to retire and move away, and meanwhile, my life was shattered. My marriage, my family, we were all struggling. And so at some point, I decided to file a civil malpractice lawsuit. It took about 3 years. And in the end, it was successful, but it was really not about punishing the abuser so much as it's a financial transaction between us and his insurance company. So it's not the justice that you get when you pursue criminal charges, but it was something, and it allowed me to stand up for myself for the first time. And I was told by several attorneys that pursuing any kind of criminal charge would have been brutal for me and my family, and that the abuser would likely walk. So not to do it. And clearly, I couldn't take on any more trauma. So yeah, I didn't even want to go near that.
That makes sense. I'm so glad you were able to get some sort of justice and also financial compensation, which is helpful to you and holds him accountable, even though it's with his insurance. That he surrendered his license is good news. Sometimes they surrender their license, but then they coach afterwards. And that's scary. We've had a few instances of that in my state where a therapist went through this and then they surrendered their license. And then it was found out later that they just continued seeing clients under the guise of coaching rather than therapy. And that's been very alarming. Now, as you advocate for victims of abusive therapists, can you talk about patterns that you see?
Well, when it first happened to me, I thought I had to be the only person on the planet to be taken advantage of as an adult. And of course, I know now that it is extremely common, and yet we all feel alone because we all think it just happened to us, that there was something wrong with us, that we were not smart enough to see the red flags. So that's the first thing, is that it is common and that survivors are not alone. And the second is that it is really challenging to peel apart the layers and see that you were actually manipulated and groomed, and that although you are an adult and there wasn't a gun to your head, there was a metaphorical one. There was emotional manipulation, which is equally powerful. And I feel like society doesn't respect that. They don't respect emotional manipulation or threats, but they still hold women captive.
Mm-hmm.
Just,
That makes total sense because listeners to this podcast have experienced it with their own husband. It's not like he's handcuffed her.
yet we're still trapped.
Yeah.
But sadly, that kind of manipulation doesn't get much respect at all. In fact, women are usually blamed. I want to make sure that survivors and that listeners understand they aren't to blame, that adults are taken advantage of all the time, and they don't have to feel guilty or ashamed or to blame. That was what I needed to hear in the beginning over and over. You're not alone and it's not your fault. You're not alone and it's not your fault, because I was just like drowning in shame and self-hatred, and I was confused. To become attached to someone who takes advantage of you leaves you utterly confused when it's over. You feel hatred on one hand for the person that hurt you, and attachment to the person you thought was loving and caring and there to support you, there to help you. So it's really hard for victims when they come out, because there's just so much that has to be sorted through and understood, and there's very few people educated on it to help us.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very important to throw a lifeline to survivors in those early days, especially, so that they can start to untangle some of that confusion.
That is exactly the abuser's intent, to hook you in emotionally and manipulate your emotions, manipulate your thoughts, and make you feel like it is you, but it's not you, right? So then you get confused and you feel shame, and that is their intent. They want you to feel shame because it keeps people from understanding what's really going on, or for going for help or talking to people. And then even if you do talk to people because you don't really know what's going on, you don't define it as abuse, and then they don't know. So it is a big mess of, he knows exactly what's going on, but we don't.
Yeah, shame is like a prison, and they do know that, and that is their intention from the beginning. Shame keeps us quiet. Like you said, even if we try to reach out, we're so confused that we're not able to explain it in a way that really shows what happened. It takes months, sometimes years, to fully wrap your head around it and then be able to reiterate it in a way that makes sense. because you can't explain something you don't understand yet yourself.
Exactly. So because listeners of this podcast have been manipulated by their husbands, and a lot of the time, I would say the majority of the time, they don't understand. And so they turn to therapists for help. And then the therapist ends up being an extension of their husband's abuse quite a bit of the time. The biggest red flag is if you know it's abuse, do not go to couple therapy. But just in general, red flags for therapists, if they stop charging you, if they run over time.
There will be no physical touch, except maybe a handshake upon meeting. It's ethical sometimes, maybe, for a therapist to give you a short hug at the end of sessions, but even then, be very careful with that. They won't talk about other clients. The one you mentioned about the couples therapy, that is a big one. If they're willing to see you both as couples and you individually, that is a red flag. They cannot be your therapist and your therapist as a couple.
100%. And almost every single pornography addiction recovery therapist does that. And it's so unethical. It's so crazy. I'm like, no, it's unethical. Number one, if it's abuse, but even the therapist doesn't know it's abuse. So they're doing all these unethical things and the client doesn't know. And apparently the therapist doesn't know, or maybe they know, but they don't care. I don't know.
When I did find a good therapist years ago, and then I suggested couples counseling to him, just bringing it up in general, he said, I can't be your therapist and your marriage therapist. And at first I wished that he could because I trusted him, but then I realized right away, that would be so hurtful because you lose your therapist when they become your couples therapist. They do not have that objectivity anymore and they do not have your best interests at heart. If you have any feeling of unease, you have permission to not go back. It's not rude or hurting their feelings. We're allowed to do what's best for us. And it's really hard, at least it was hard for me to think that way, that I don't even have to have a reason. You just make me feel uncomfortable. That's something that to listen to.
Yeah. And you also don't need to tell them that. You can cancel the appointment and just never go back and not tell them why.
Yeah, you don't owe them anything.
Yes, you owe them zero things.
Right.
Yes.
It is a business transaction. It's a service that you're paying. If they are helping you, then you continue. Otherwise, you find someone else. A lot of the red flags are things that I felt in my gut. So it's hard to put them all into words.
But maybe that's the most important one. I think a lot of women in this space, our listeners, they go and they think, I don't know, it didn't quite feel right, but next time I will be able to explain it better. Or we made some progress, and so next time I'll be able to. Like, oh, we're getting close. And I want to say, if you're constantly feeling like you're quote unquote getting close, but you still feel uncomfortable, that would be a red flag. A lot of women, when they come to BTR and they schedule sessions with our coaches or they come to our group sessions, one of the main things they say is they understood it right away. They totally got it. They were able to help me. I didn't have to spend time and money trying to explain it to them, almost like you're educating the therapist that your husband's abusive rather than our coaches, because they're abuse coaches, helping you see, okay, is this abuse? And can help you immediately. And so always thinking that next time maybe you'll get over the discomfort is a red flag.
I was just going to say that if you feel like the burden of proof is on you, then that's not a good fit. The therapist should immediately be able to recognize it as abuse and should be able to support you and help you understand it, not the other way around. If you have to over-explain yourself or defend yourself in any way, then it's not the therapist for you. If they're ethical, you feel heard and seen and valued. They won't make you feel questioned or attacked or belittled. But since we're used to, I think, a lot of us taking abuse from people, we feel it's our responsibility. And that if they miss the mark, we give them another chance or we see how it goes, when we don't deserve to be hurt anymore. And we certainly don't need to pay for it.
Exactly. Exactly. Like you're paying someone to help you. If you feel like you have to explain it to them or educate them rather than like
feeling lighter, feeling validated, feeling heard and seen, and feeling some semblance of hope. There's hope because somebody sees me and somebody gets it. That's how you should feel when you leave.
it's hard with betrayal trauma and abuse because hope is tricky. Here at BTR, we're like, there is hope. You can live free from abuse. We have a living free workshop. You can get to emotional and psychological safety. And that may mean that you need to start setting boundaries and separating yourself from the harm. And that doesn't feel hopeful because there might not be hope for the marriage, which is very hard to face. But if therapists are giving victims hope in the wrong thing, like my ex was extremely emotionally and psychologically abusive. I remember one therapist who was like, he's a really good guy. Of course we can work this out.
Oh, gosh.
And so I did feel hope, but it was hope in the wrong thing. It was hope that this abusive man could be non-abusive, and that wasn't going to happen for me. So you want to feel hopeful, also realistic about your situation. I think that's another important thing, that they're not giving you false hope.
That's very important. Yes.
At BTR, we might be like, he is abusive. We do need to get to safety. It's actually going to be kind of hard, but you can do it. We believe in you. You're strong and you're brave, and let's start moving towards safety, emotional safety, psychological safety. We don't know what path you're going to take, but this, oh, come to me and I'll solve all your problems. It'll be really quick. And this is like easy to solve. That's also a red flag.
Yes, I agree. Hope that things can change eventually, that you don't have to stay in this same pattern that you've been in for all these years. Like you said, it may be very uncomfortable getting there, but it's possible. Yeah, I can see how therapists can re-traumatize so many people. Today, we were referring to my therapist who intentionally harms people. He does it for fun. I think there's therapists that do their best but don't have the skills. You really do have to be picky and keep going until you find somebody that you feel is a fit and that really hears you and gets it.
I'm always concerned, especially when it comes to abuse. Like you might talk to clergy or friends, and the automatic thing everyone says, they don't understand it's abuse. Also, even if they know it's abuse, they don't know that you shouldn't go to couple therapy or therapy about it. Immediately, they're like, oh, well, therapy solves everything. And I want to caution people about that idea as well. There are things that therapy can be really helpful for. Being an abuse victim, there's not necessarily something wrong with you. In your case, you were going to therapy to get help for something specific that you wanted to change about yourself. That is a good reason to go to therapy. But when someone's hurting you, they're messed up, not you. Therapy is not the answer for every single thing, I guess. Sometimes you might need a friend or a hiking group. Thinking that there's inherently something wrong with you in your situation and that therapy can solve it when really there isn't something wrong with you. I sometimes feel like people go in and the therapist finds something wrong with the person that wasn't even there to begin with, and especially if they're an abuse victim. Like, let's talk about why you picked and you didn't do anything to deserve to be treated that way. It's almost a form of victim blaming in some ways.
I do. And that really comes down to picking the right therapist, because I feel like so much damage can be done, but I feel like so much healing can happen in just supporting you through it.
Mm-hmm.
Not saying you need to be here, but I want to walk alongside of you through this journey that you're on. So if you look at it like that, I feel like it can be beneficial. The right therapist isn't going to make you feel at fault. You may get there some point where you want to analyze things, but I just think it's good to have somebody to walk alongside you who understands it. I was hurt over and over by friends and family because they don't get it. They don't understand it. They don't relate to it. So almost everything they said to me was offensive. They would say things to me like, well, why did you go back? And just different questions along that line. And it was so painful because I already was beating myself up with that very same thing. I don't know. And so someone who does understand it is going to be a safer person to talk to than somebody who doesn't understand.
Yeah, whether it be a therapist or not, talking to someone who understands abuse is the answer. It breaks my heart that women have to try therapist after therapist after therapist after therapist to find a safe one. That's actually why I created BTR, because I didn't want any woman to have to go through that heartbreaking process, because you don't always know right after the first session. And also, a lot of times when they find out it's abuse, therapists don't really have concrete ways of helping you, which is why I created the Living Free workshop, which I mentioned earlier. And if you want to learn more about that, go to btr.org/livingfree. But it's hard because clergy, family, so many people don't understand.
I'll tell you, when you mentioned clergy, I just bristled, because the other thing that we get a lot is that the abuser is just sinning. He's just a sinner in need of help. I heard that about my own abuser, even though he was like a psychopath who was intentionally harming women over his entire career. So for me, I would shy away from going to a pastor or a religious person, because that's often the approach they take, and that's also damaging and re-traumatizing.
And if they're going to try and get the sinner, quote unquote, to repent, but then you're still in proximity to that abuser, and he can just manipulate the whole situation.
Right. I just wouldn't recommend it. They don't have the training to properly help a woman in that situation. And like you said, it's going to be more about, well, can you forgive them? They're just sinning and they're broken. Well, no, they're intentionally choosing to hurt someone. For me, I was not able to escape on my own. I tried, and I didn't want to tell anyone else because I was embarrassed and didn't think they'd understand, but it just kept me there longer. I couldn't break the emotional tie either. He would guilt me, manipulate me. So you need to reach out for help. However, the first person I reached out to for help blamed me and took the abuser's side. And it crushed me so much that I stayed longer. So you have to tell and continue to tell until you're heard. It's so devastating when we do reach out for help and we're not believed, or we're blown off, or we're blamed. We give up altogether.
I absolutely agree. We hear that a lot here at BTR, that women have been to therapist after therapist after therapist, or talked to their clergy. Every time you reach out, even if you get shut down, which is devastating, you are doing the right thing. And finally, when they come here, they're like, oh, yes. And it's because we get it immediately. But I want to praise them for continuing to try to get help. And then when they find us, I'm so glad, because I'm like, we're here for you. Amy, thank you so much for being so brave and sharing your story so that other victims can relate with it and hopefully learn something together. Thank you so much for sharing.
Yes, thank you for having me.
If this podcast is helpful to you, please help us reach other women by following or subscribing and giving us a 5-star rating. Thank you for helping other women find us. If you've already purchased a copy of my book, Trauma Mama, Husband Drama, please circle back and give it a 5-star rating. A lot of women are searching for books about betrayal trauma on Amazon, and rating Trauma Mama will help them find this podcast, which is free to everyone. Your donations keep this podcast going. Go to our website, btr.org, scroll to the bottom, click on Support the BTR Podcast. And until next week, stay safe out there.